Thank you very much, Troy, and thank you to all of the wonderful participants who are part of the Canada Strong and Free network and the broader conservative movement in Canada. All of us here in the United States are in the conservative movement and at the Leadership Institute are always rooting for each and every one of you to advance the cause of freedom in your country, and I hope that we see further movement in that direction soon, which I'm confident will be the case. Why don't we pull up the PowerPoint and we can get started with that. So there are many different communications presentations that I've sat through in my 32 years in politics, and very often, we're starting with, well, what should the message be? What should the words be? What should our vocabulary, imagery, and so on be? But I want to take a step back and start with a question on the screen right now, and that is that first, we need to understand how people make judgments and choices. And then once we have an understanding of that, we can create messages that resonate with our target audience. But first, we have to understand a little bit about decision making. So I'm going to ask that we go to the next slide, and then I'm going to ask that we're going to play a video. We're going to play an ad, a television ad that has nothing to do with politics or public policy. But as you watch this ad on the next slide, I'm going to ask you to think, if you had to pick which of the two people in this ad is the conservative, which one would it be? So let's advance to the next slide and play the video.
Hello, I'm a Mac.
And I'm a PC.
Ready to get started?
Well, not quite. Got a lot to do. What's your big plan?
I might make a home movie or maybe create a website, try out my built-in camera. I can do it all right out of the box, so what about you?
Well, first I got to download those new drivers, and I got to erase the trial software that came on my hard drive.
Sweet.
And I've got a lot of manuals to read.
You know, it sounds like you have a lot of stuff to do before you do any stuff, so I'm just gonna get started because I'm kind of excited. Let me know when you're ready.
Actually, the rest of me's in some other boxes, so I'll meet up with you later.
So that spot's a clever, fun spot. It has, it has nothing to do with politics whatsoever. But if you had to pick which one of these two people is the conservative, and I've asked this question to audiences on multiple continents around the world, the overwhelming majority of people will say that it's the fellow on the left who's currently holding his hands above his head, that he's probably the conservative. And then I'll go and ask audience members, well, on what basis would you base that conclusion? And people would point to a number of different things. One would be how he appears. The fellow on the left is dressed in a somewhat dated suit that doesn't exactly look like an Armani. He's wearing a tie. He's wearing a watch. He has kind of a boring haircut. He looks older. So those are all visual signals that we're taking from him. Then other people would point to his behavior. He's a little more awkward. He doesn't get out of the box. The fellow on the right, the younger person on the right, jumps out of the box, more action-oriented. And so there we're seeing behavior. And then if you listen to what they talk about, the person on the right is talking about outcomes and action, and the person on the left is bogged down in process. And so the visual, the verbal, and the behavioral signals that we're taking in lead most people to that same conclusion. Now, what's more important than what I just asked is, did it take, if you thought about that same process in your mind, did it take you longer to draw the conclusion, or did it take you longer to come up with the reasons why? And the overwhelming majority of people will respond correctly that it took them longer to come up with the reasons why. The conclusion they were able to reach very quickly, but the reasons why took longer, right? They had to kind of think through, well, what is it about that I'm seeing, and so on. And that is an important lesson for today. And that is that the conclusion was drawn first, and then the reasons were determined secondly. And in doing so, let's advance to the next slide. What we've just touched upon is the difference between intuition and reasoning. And, there are many people who will, look at the world in terms of logic versus emotion, Kirk versus Spock, so on and so forth, masculine versus feminine. And for purposes of our discussion today, I want you to instead think of intuition and reasoning. When we're developing strategic communications, it is vitally important that we understand the difference between the two. Intuition is something that we are doing most of the time. It's how we draw most of our conclusions and we make most of our decisions during the course of the day. Intuition is recognizing, making judgments and choices, and doing so automatically. You're walking down the street, you see some weird person talking to themselves, perhaps you avoid them. You are driving down the road, you recognize that there is an accident in the head, you automatically move away from that. That is your intuition kicking in because you recognize something, either visual or behavioral, you made a judgment, choice, you did so automatically. Reasoning is different. Reasoning is the process that we use when we are either explaining or persuading. And this is a higher, more sophisticated function in communications to use our reasoning. Again, to explain or to persuade. And there is a difference between the two in terms of which is dominant and which is more prominent in our thinking. If we go to the next slide, in this representation, the elephant is your intuition. It's big, it's dominant, it's going to go where it wants to go. Your reasoning is the rider, and it's more articulate, it's more sophisticated, it has better long distance vision, etc. But we have to recognize that the rider is working for the elephant, meaning our reasoning backs up our intuition, not the other way around. And this tends to run counter to how we think we make decisions, right? I'm a rational person. I'm a conservative. I'm a thinker. I carefully consider every decision that I have to make. I carefully consider all of the ramifications of that, and then and only then do I draw a conclusion and take an action. Well, every car salesman knows that is not how people make decisions. No Ferrari owner makes decisions that way, right? And I'll give you an example of how that works in just a moment. So let's advance on to the next slide. We have to recognize that intuition is an automatic response to things that we recognize. It's making judgments and choices based upon what we know or based upon what we believe to be true. And when we're communicating with an audience, it's what that audience believes to be true that is going to drive their intuitive response to the messages that we are sending, to what we are communicating with to them. Let's go to the next slide. So let me give you an example of how this works, how our intuition and our reasoning work together. Let's advance, and you'll see a picture. Let's say you're this guy in the tie, and you are going to be home very late from some event, right? You said you were going to be home at 6, and you come, wandering into the house, at 11:30 midnight. Well, it doesn't take a lot of brain power to recognize that this is going to be an unpleasant experience. And so what you do is, let's advance, is we call upon the reasoning side of our brain to come up with all of the reasons why we should not get yelled at when we get home. I was at this great conference. I learned so much. It's going to be helpful for my career. I met all these great people, and on and on and on. In other words, our intuition tells us what we are anticipating, and then we call upon our reasoning to back us up. In the same way that the new Ferrari owner, on the way as they're driving that new Ferrari home, is coming up with all of the what we call the rationalizations as to why that was really a brilliant financial decision, to buy a Ferrari. Let's advance. In strategic communications, no matter what organization, cause, mission, candidacy you're involved with, you have a limited amount of attention from the audience you're attempting to communicate with. You have a limited amount of bandwidth. And the advantage in strategic communications goes to the side that has intuition on their side. Meaning, if you can have an audience reach the conclusions you want them to draw intuitively, rather than having to explain it, you're going to be in a better position. It's very often been said in politics that if you're explaining, you're losing. And there's some truth to that. That's not always true. But by and large, if you find yourself in a position where you've lost the audience, you're having to explain something because they're not already with you, because they did not intuitively reach the conclusion that you want them to draw, then you are at a disadvantage. And I'll graphically show you why that is the case in just a moment. So let's advance to the next slide. So we should all be conscious of the signals that we are sending out to people as communicators. And we should be aware of how those signals are being interpreted by those we're communicating with. That is, what type of visual signals are we sending? What type of behavioral signals are we sending? Things like reputation is a signal, and in fact, a reputation runs well ahead of you. Particularly in an age of social media and the like, your reputation is running well ahead of you, and that is another signal that affects how people are going to intuitively respond to our messaging. What type of associations do we have that will impact and send signals as well for how the audience is going to respond to us? Next, please. So let's keep going. Whenever we are communicating with an audience, whenever they are looking at us, whenever they are listening to us, whenever they are hearing about us, that members of that audience are going to have a response across a spectrum. It's not binary, it's across a spectrum. And that spectrum ranges from acceptance to rejection. And the ideal is people are hearing from us and observing us, and intuitively they accept what it is that we have to say, and we're good to go. We've done it. We call this the intuitive pathway. And this is the most effective way to communicate with an audience, where intuitively they're going where you want them to go. On the other hand, if they initially reject us intuitively, if their intuition sends them off in the wrong direction, then we have to use our reasoning to persuade them, to try to pull them over from rejection to acceptance. And the difference between the two is that the intuitive pathway is cheap and easy. The persuasive pathway is expensive and difficult. And so if we really want to maximize our effectiveness through reaching people on that intuitive level, rather than having to pull them over and explain it. And this is counterintuitive to how some people who are new to public policy might approach communications, because some people who are new, they can't wait to go out there and talk about their sidewalk privatization plan, or convince people of whatever it is they want to convince them of. But if you find yourself in that position where you're having to wage that battle, it might be because you missed an opportunity to intuitively reach people and bring them over to where you need them to be. Let's go to the next slide. So intuitively, what are some qualities that people are looking for in a leader or in a communicator? And this is important to understand, because we want to reach people on that intuitive level. So when you are in a position of leadership, there are a few things that intuitively people will tend to look for. And the first of those is vision. If you're a candidate, what's your vision for the country or the province or the city or the municipality or whatever it is you are seeking to lead? If you're running for a party leadership position, what's your vision for the party? If you're running for a position of leadership in a nonprofit, what's your vision of the nonprofit? And that vision is important, because people will make sacrifices in pursuit of a vision that they buy into, that they agree with, that they find compelling. Vision is key to motivating other people to do things that they don't necessarily have to do. That includes, by the way, raising money, because a donor does not have to contribute funds to a cause, a candidate, a nonprofit, etc. But if there is a vision there that they find compelling, that is critically important to that. And it should be positive, it should be forward-looking, it should be aspirational, meaning it should be better than today, but it also has to be credible. And so number one is that people are looking for leaders and communicators to have a vision. But vision itself is not enough. If having a vision was sufficient by itself, then people can just go into philosophy or the ministry or so on, and we can deal with how the world should be, instead of the further burden which leaders have, which is the ability to turn vision into reality. And so that is the second thing that people are looking for in a leader, in a communicator. And when you're communicating with an audience, you're in a position of leadership. That's an important trait to understand. If your credibility as a communicator is tied to these same leadership qualities, do they have a vision, et cetera, et cetera. So the second quality that people look for in a leader is, can you turn vision into reality? Can you get something done? And that is why people who are seeking positions of leadership should be able to point to things that they have accomplished in the past, where it's powerful to have people offering third-party testimonials, for example, other people saying that this is a person who got something done, who overcame an obstacle, things to that effect. I have on the screen here, on the left, you see a picture of Dubai in the 1970s. On the right, you see a picture of Dubai today. And you can tell that somebody had a vision, but it wasn't just a vision. It wasn't just a dream, but they had the ability to turn that dream into reality, to turn that vision into reality. Next slide. Leaders are also expected to project strength. An audience will tend to not give as much attention or not defer as much to a communicator, a presenter, a leader who projects weakness. And so projecting strength, of course, is important. I have a picture of great strong leader Winston Churchill here. And that strength gives leaders grace under fire. It's been said very often that the person who's yelling and screaming is the one who's lost control. That's absolutely true. Yelling and screaming and losing control is exactly that. It's a sign that someone has lost control. But strength gives a leader, a communicator, grace under fire, so they can communicate more effectively, and they will be more effective, and the audience will respond better to them. That being said, there's another quality that people also look for in a leader that is the yin to that yang, and that is on the next slide, that leaders are expected to care about others. So there's strength and caring. And sometimes on the conservative side, there's a tendency to indulge a little too much on the strength side and not sufficiently on the caring side. The single greatest asset that the left has is that they are perceived by many people to be more caring about others than people on the right. There's a tendency for people on the right to come across as overly dogmatic, overly concerned about process, overly concerned about rules, and less concerned about outcomes and people. And that's why it's so important to keep this in mind. And I'm going to emphasize this repeatedly in different ways over the course of my remaining minutes. And that this is how the left tends to win fights, and this tends to be how the right loses fights over when it comes to being perceived as caring about other people. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Next, leaders are expected to be honest. This is a critical quality. It's why if you're in a competitive contest, for example, for public office, your opponent in a competitive contest will very quickly try to find ways to demonstrate that your side is not honest, because without that perception of honesty, you don't get to compete in the contest. So leaders are expected to be honest, and we have to recognize that the burden of proof in the court of public opinion is a lot lower than in a court of law. So we have to make sure that those of us who are engaged in the public policy process recognize that, and that we have a higher standard that we have to adhere to. Optics matter, how things look matter. It's not simply whether something is legal or not. And then finally, leaders are expected to treat people fairly. This is why it's important for communicators to never get into a fight unless it's on purpose, right? You don't want to be in a position where someone asks a hostile question, for example, at a town hall event, when those are possible, and we get in a shouting match with that person, or we talk down to that person, et cetera, because that sends a signal as to what type of person is in that position of command. That's why that grace under fire is so important, and so leaders can recognize when others are being exploited. People expect those in leadership positions to recognize and take action when others are being exploited, particularly when those people are perceived to be vulnerable. It's the same thing as if you're walking on the sidewalk and someone 50 meters ahead of you walks by someone who's just fallen and is bleeding on the sidewalk, and you see someone just walk right past them. We tend to have a negative reaction to that. And then if the person who's just fallen and is bleeding is handicapped and fell out of their wheelchair and is bleeding, the reaction is even more strong, right? Because people expect that others will be sensitive to when others are being exploited and so on. And that's why very often in public policy, we have to make sure that we articulate who the victim is in any particular struggle, and that we articulate how we are on the side of the victim, because leaders are expected to treat people fairly, particularly when they are in positions of authority. Next, let's go to the next one. Here's a summary of those 6 leadership imperatives that people expect for people in positions of leadership. On the right, we will very often treat morality as universal, that there are universal morals, that and morality is strictly universal. And for purposes of this discussion, I want to flip that around and think in terms of each person has their own personal moral system, which they use to respond to what they see in the world around them. And so for purpose of this discussion, I want you to think in terms of morality as being personal to each individual. And that is that people will respond differently to different things. You go see a film with someone, right? You see things in that film, the two people respond differently. Why? Because they're responding according to their own personal moral system. You're sitting down with your spouse, you're reading an article in the newspaper, one of you is upset, the other's not upset. Why is there a difference? Because your personal moral system is interpreting those signals that you're getting from that news story in different ways, because your personal moral system is different. And so there are 6 moral foundations that are important for us to understand and recognize, and things become emotional when something that someone sees or hears about touches one of those moral foundations. And I'm going to walk through the 6 and then show you how it works differently for people on the left and the right. So the first on the next slide is caring, and the opposite of which is harm. We tend to not like people who inflict harm upon others, right? Someone who murders a police officer, someone who assaults a person on the street, someone who takes advantage of the elderly, etc. That when we feel a negative reaction to someone being harmed in that way, it is that caring moral foundation that has been triggered. And this is one of the strongest concepts in strategic communications, is this concept of caring, right? So that's number 1. Number 2, next slide, is, let's go on the next slide. The second is fairness, and that is that we don't like people who cheat. Corruption in public office is a particularly powerful issue because it's going to touch on multiple of these. But when people act in a corrupt manner to enrich themselves, it triggers this fairness moral foundation, and that it is not fair that some politician abuse their office to enrich themselves and where other people don't have that same opportunity. So we respond negatively to signs of cheating. We respond negatively to someone if we have been led to believe or convinced that they are a cheater, that they do not treat people fairly, that they improperly discriminate where such discrimination is not warranted in the eyes of the audience. So the second moral foundation is fairness. The third moral foundation is liberty, the opposite of which is oppression. And this really explains everything from the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Many historical events can be explained in this way. Why is it that invasions tend not to work so well? Because when there is a perception that there is an outside presence who's come in and is oppressing a group of people, there is a natural tendency to respond to that and to throw out the oppressor. The Magna Carta, there are many examples throughout history where this moral foundation was triggered sufficiently, because it's by the way, it's the same moral foundation if you don't really like your boss, right? If your boss is someone who, is a real jerk and comes in yelling and screaming all the time and is unfair to people and is a real tyrant, and everybody wants to get together, the first thing they do is they all talk behind the person's back, and then they figure out how they can get rid of them or restrain them. That's the liberty moral foundation at work. Next. The next is authority, and the opposite of which is subversion. We tend to respond negatively to people who are subversive to authority. On the right, we tend to be more sensitive to this than people on the left tend to be. I'll explain why in just a moment. But if you see there's an intern in the office who is saying bad things about their supervisor, and is kind of cheating on getting their work done, and is kind of fudging things and so on, and subverting that authority in the office, and we respond negatively to that. That's this moral foundation that is acting out. In the same way, if when you're out on the street and you didn't put money in the parking meter, if someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, you didn't put money in the parking meter," and you might tend to blow that person off. But if they're wearing a police uniform, you're not going to blow them off. You're going to treat them differently. That is that authority moral foundation that is acting as a guide there. Next. Sanctity, the opposite of which is desecration. Or degradation, same thing. Why do we react differently if a church burns down than if the post office burns down? Why is it that the entire world tuned in when the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, the roof of which was burning, the entire world tuned in via cable television to watch that? Whereas if it was, some, post office in Moscow, nobody would really care, because it's that sanctity moral foundation that is kicking in. There are certain symbols and places and so on that we revere, that we hold in high regard. It's part of the reason why we have rituals, both in government, for example, at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and in religious settings and the like. Whenever you see that there is a ritual in place, or there is a place or a person or a symbol that we hold in high regard, it's that sanctity moral foundation kicking in. Why do we react differently to someone burning a flag than someone burning a tablecloth? They're both made of fabric, they're both colored, but we react much more strongly if that's a flag that we identify with. So chances are you would respond differently to the burning of the Canadian flag than to the burning of the flag of Morocco. Because you have a stronger connection to that Canadian flag, that your sanctity moral foundation is being triggered by that event in a way that the burning of a symbol that you're not connected to would. Next. And then finally, there is a loyalty moral foundation, and that is that we respond negatively to people who betray the group, whether that's Benedict Arnold, or whether that is, some spy or some turncoat, or someone sometimes who, leaves one company and goes and works for a competitor. We might react negatively to them because there's a sense of betrayal that they betrayed the group. When we feel that way, that's the loyalty moral foundation that's being triggered. Next, please. The signals that we send out to people are powerful when they touch someone's moral foundations. That is how something becomes emotional, and emotion drives behavior. And so it's important to understand the makeup of the audience. When we know the audience, we have a better understanding of which moral foundations are going to which they are going to be more sensitive, or is more likely to trigger an emotional response, to get people fired up, to drive people to action. And every Hollywood director, next slide, knows this. Every Hollywood director understands this. What makes a movie a good movie? What makes a film a good film to you? Well, if you think about it, it tends to be how a film makes us feel, right? So the film has to be credible enough to pass through our mind, right? That's what makes it credible, so that it looks like it's real life. But then in order to touch us on an emotional level, it has to trigger something here in our heart. And it is through these one or more of these moral foundations that is done, that gets people fired up. It's, by the way, it's a very interesting component of evolutionary psychology as to why we respond emotionally to pictures, to film, etc. When we know it's in our mind, we know it's not real, right? So think about it. If you go to a film and you get emotional over what you see, it's a sad scene or, exhilarating scene or whatever, you know that that's not real, right? You know that's not really happening right now. In your mind, you know that I'm looking at a screen of something that's completely fake, that was filmed, probably more than a year ago, or now, probably more than 2 years ago, never happened. There is no Superman, there is no Lois Lane, etc. And yet still, we can have an emotional response to that. And why is that? Because it's close enough, right? Because as people were developing these responses over time, there were no cartoons, there were no movies, etc. When you saw something, it was real. So your mind interprets that when it sees an image, it treats it as though it's real. It's not differentiating between what it's a representation of and the real thing, right? So that is how people can be moved by images, by things that they see in the mail, that they see on social media and video, etc. Because our mind, in terms of the reaction, is not differentiating between real life and what it is. The image that they're seeing, whether it's on paper or film or on an LCD screen. So we trigger people's moral foundations. We trigger people's emotional responses through each of these moral foundations. And I want to show you how to recognize that, right? So I'm going to go to the next slide. And I had wanted to show 4 full-length movies, but Troy said I couldn't do that. It would take too long. So I'm going to show you 4 trailers. Now, I hope that using Zoom, I hope it's going to be okay. I hope we're not going to get too choppy here. But I want to show you 4 trailers. And then I'm going to ask you to think about which moral foundation is at the center of that film. Because the trailer is going to tell you which moral foundation is at the center of the film. So let's go to the next one, and let's play the first trailer.
You're in the Air Force, right?
Marines, actually.
How long are you here for?
A few weeks.
30 seconds left. Just get us in field goal range.
22!
The blackout may run along the entire northwest corridor.
What's going on?
Get to the cabin.
Jed, you take care of your brother, you hear me?
All right, now go now. Go while you still can. Let's go.
If you're seeing this broadcast, you are in a part of the country no longer controlled by the government of the United States.
Boys, I love you both, but I want you to do what I would do. Kill this piece.
They mess with the wrong family.
How did this happen?
There's a new class of weapon. Everything went offline and never came back. They wipe us out, including U.S. Central Command.
What am I supposed to do?
I'm gonna fight. Anybody who wants to join is welcome to it. We'll hit them on our terms.
We're the Wolverines.
And we create chaos. We need to steal that weapon.
It'd be the foothold we need and take our homes back.
I can't.
Yes, you can. Relax. And squeeze.
And we inherited our freedom. Now it's up to all of us to fight for it. For them, this is just some place. For us, this is our home.
Now, forgiving the producers for casting an Aussie in the lead role of the remake of Red Dawn, what is this film about? Here you see on the screens those 6 moral foundations. What is at the center of this film? Well, I think it's pretty evident that liberty is at the center of this film. There are other aspects as well. You see loyalty, caring, fairness, etc., in here as well. But at the center of it really is this fight against an outside oppressor. And that is that liberty moral foundation that's being triggered repeatedly through the story itself, through symbolism, through imagery, and the like. Let's go to the next one. Very, very different film. Touches on a different moral foundation. Let's advance to that, and let's play that trailer.
Cristo, dame fuerza. Cristo, dame fuerza.
You and I, Robert, we have observed history. We are in history now. We are in the middle of a war, one that's been going on forever, to protect a secret so powerful that if revealed, it would devastate the very foundations of mankind.
I'm into something here I can't understand.
Witness the biggest cover-up in human history.
That this film, the Da Vinci Code, oozes in sanctity. It's that sanctity moral foundation that is at the center of everything in this film. Again, you see the others, and there's a tendency, if a film only invokes one of the moral foundations, it tends not to do as well because it only appeals to a limited audience. So a good writer and director will ensure that the film appeals, touches people on a variety of those moral foundations. But really, when we see this level of the artwork, the religious symbolism, etc., all of that is invoking that sanctity moral foundation. I'm going to ask the producers to. We're going to skip 2 of the trailers just on account of time, and I'm going to ask if we could advance to slide 43, please. I want to be sensitive to Troy and your schedule there. If we could advance to slide 43, that'd be great. There are two other trailers that I normally would show, but I want to be sensitive again to the time here. So let's just go on to this point here, and that is that why am I showing movie trailers during a strategic communications presentation to a conference of people engaged in the public policy process? For a very good reason. Let's advance to the next slide. And that is, we should understand, is there a relationship between a person's political leanings and which moral foundations are important to them? Well, it turns out there is a direct correlation, and it's very, very important that we understand how that correlation works. Let's go to the next slide. How you determine which moral foundation is most important to a person is by posing a series of moral dilemmas. What's a moral dilemma? It is a story which pits one moral foundation against the other and asks people to make a choice. That's why it's a dilemma, because you are literally choosing one moral foundation over another. And so in the book The Righteous Mind, which part of this presentation is based upon, and I want to strongly recommend, I'll include that title later on, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, Haydt. The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion is the name of the book. I highly recommend it to any conservative in the public policy process. Leftists, I do not encourage to read it because I don't want them to know all the stuff that's in the book. But the author conducted a series of questionnaires with test subjects, over 100,000, and shared these variety of moral dilemmas, asking people to choose one side or the other. And then he also asked whether they identify as a liberal, conservative, very liberal, and so on. And what he found is that that among the further to the right you go, the more you find that people have a blend in terms of which moral foundations are important to them. But the further to the left that you are, so among people on the left, people who are very liberal, you see here that the caring and fairness moral foundations are overwhelmingly dominant among people who are on the left. You find that as you go further toward the center, in the center as well, it's not as much of a gap. But people in the political center, or people who tend to be more ambivalent toward politics, caring and fairness tends to be the overriding moral foundations to which they respond when messages are anchored in those two. Now, that is an important lesson for every conservative to understand, and that is that you will notice that very often when the left advances an argument, they will almost always frame it as a caring argument or a fairness argument. It doesn't matter what the issue is, whether it's marriage, drug legalization, issues related to taxes, healthcare, the environment, etc. It is always portrayed, almost always, as a caring or fairness issue. Now, why do they do that? Well, number one, it's because that's where they tend to go. Those are the arguments that work best for themselves, as someone on the left. But it's also advantageous for them to do so because those people in the center who tend to be the swing vote, who tend to determine the outcome of many campaigns and public policy fights, those people in the center tend to be more responsive to caring and fairness messages than messages that are anchored in other moral foundations. The further to the right you go, so let's say if you're running a campaign for Conservative Party leader, right? Well, in that case, your target audience is much further to the right, and thus your messaging would incorporate to a greater degree touching these other moral foundations. So ask yourself this question. If a group of radical leftists holds a protest in Vancouver, for example, a bunch of radical leftists, versus you have a group of people on the right who hold their own protests, where will you tend to find more Canadian flags? If you think about the counterpart in the United States, if there is a Black Lives Matter rally and there is a Tea Party rally, where are you likely to find more American flags? You tend to find them more in the group that's affiliated with the right. And why is that? Because you see that loyalty moral foundation is more important to people on the right than the left. Patriotism is an expression of loyalty to the country, and so you tend to find that more on the right. Groups on the right tend to be more likely to invoke patriotic symbols, more responsive to patriotic messages, symbolism, imagery, and the like. Whereas people in the center, there tends to be less of a responsiveness to that, or less feeling as strongly about that. And then when you get to the left, that's not very much a factor there at all. The vulnerability the key vulnerability for conservative candidates and communicators it comes in exposing and leaving exposed your flank on the caring and fairness side of the argument. It is important in any strategic communication struggle to not concede the caring or fairness side of the argument. This requires doing something that some conservatives find uncomfortable, it's icky, it's not really principled, etc. What it requires doing in many cases is, number one, to identify who is the victim in the public policy fight that you're having. Who, in your view, is the victim, and how are you, with your side, either your candidacy or your side on the issue, how are you on the side of the victim in that particular issue, in that particular struggle? If there is a bad public policy that you are trying to have overturned, who is the victim? How can that victim be effectively communicated in the most sympathetic way possible? And how are you on the side of that victim? Conservatives, because of our nature, tend to rely more upon, well, the Constitution and legal principle and blah, blah, blah. And we tend to, furrow our brow when we do that. We get all like this. Nobody wants to hear this, right? Nobody wants to be lectured to on, some abstract legal principle going back to some philosopher who's been dead for 300 years. Nobody's going to be persuaded by that. People are much more likely to be persuaded by an argument which presents who is the victim, how is that person being harmed, how can we stop that harm from taking place, how is my position representative of that? It is a very fundamentally different approach, but it is a far more effective one in the vast majority of cases. The related point that I want to emphasize here is the importance of what we call the because clause, and that is that we have to make sure that when we are explaining why we hold a position, why we're holding a candidate, why we're supporting a candidate, the most important question in a public policy struggle is why. Why do we support a candidate, or why do we hold that position, etc.? Because if we don't answer the why, our opponents will step in and they'll fill in. Oh, they'll be more than happy to tell people why we hold that position, right? Because we just want to help our corporate friends, or because you're a bunch of racists, or whatever it is, they will be more than happy to fill in the blank. We want to cut taxes? Great. Why? And in explaining the why, in conveying that, that is where we invoke who is the victim of the bad policy, how are they being affected, how is my alternative better? And it doesn't matter what the subject area is, whether it's petroleum in the West, or whether it's trade, whatever that happens to be, this can be done effectively. We are going to wrap up by 20 past the hour. I've got a couple more slides I want to run through really quickly. So I haven't updated these slides since 2012. I'm using 2012 as an example. Why did Mitt Romney not become president of the United States in 2012? Next. We already know that among swing constituents, among swing voters, they tend to be more sensitive to the caring and fairness side of the argument. So the Obama campaign in 2012, what did they seek to do? They sought to take away from Mitt Romney those qualities of caring and fairness. They sought to portray him as lacking in those qualities. And if you are here as part of this conference, then you have probably had those arguments used against you before by some opponent who tries to portray your side as lacking the qualities of caring and fairness, which, by the way, is why we always have to highlight how our side is on the side of caring and fairness and the other team is not. Next. So, next slide. So we saw pictures like this. I mean, look at this fellow, right? This is somebody, correct. This is somebody's uncle. This is somebody's brother. This is someone's brother-in-law. This is somebody's, father. This doesn't look like a very rich guy. He's not wearing a tie. He's not all fancy. And he says that Mitt Romney is shipping his job to China. This picture right here is a caring and fairness picture, because it's not fair, right, in the eyes of many people, that this poor guy's job is being shipped off to China by this guy, the guy on the next slide. This guy, the guy in the middle of this picture. This is the worst photograph in the worst Kodak moment in the history of modern photography, right? This is Mitt Romney in the center here. And by the way, I know Mitt Romney, he's a terrific guy. Nothing here meant to be disparaging about him whatsoever. He is one of the most caring and fair people you can ever know. However, politics is warfare by other means, and the Obama team didn't care whether he was really a nice guy. They just wanted to take these qualities away from him. So you saw pictures like this being repeated endlessly, that this guy, by the way, this was at a year-end event. They were celebrating how much money they had made that year at Bain Capital and so on. So, not a great picture for future political campaigns. But that guy was taking the other guy's job and shipping it to China. Next slide, please. We heard there was one time Mitt and his wife Ann appeared on the Today Show and told a story about how they were on vacation one time, and on the way back, Mitt had to, quote, tie the dog to the roof of the car. Well, that story got relayed endlessly, but he didn't tie the dog to the roof of the car. The dog was sick. The dog had the runs. They had the dog in the crate, the dog crate. The crate was tied to the roof of the car. They drove home. It was not blizzard conditions. It was not the winter. The dog lived. Everybody was fine, etc. But this story got endlessly retold by the Obama people over and over and over again. Why? Because if Mitt Romney could do that to man's best friend, to tie his dog to the roof of his car, if he could do that to his own dog, what could he do to you? Right? And so that's how we see those portrayals working. Next. Just 2 years earlier, when I was chairman of the California Republican Party in 2010, we saw the same thing play out. Next slide. Our candidate for governor was Meg Whitman, very capable woman, former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, former CEO of HP, broke through many, many glass ceilings in Silicon Valley, very distinguished, successful business career. Spent $166 million, give or take, of her own money on the campaign, did not win. And you see what the left was doing here. The left was portraying her, right? They got this bust, they painted it the same colors of her campaign. And look at the language, right? Queen Meg, rich enough to rule, not rich enough to govern, right, but rich enough to rule, trying to take that and hold it against her, right? They're taking away any qualities of caring and fairness that people might see in her. Next. You see memes, right? I mean, Be Rich, which is a play on the old television show from the 1960s, Bewitched, right? Next one. They had these guys, and they're guys. All three of these people are guys, including the one in the middle, dressed up as Queen Meg, associated, being escorted by her bodyguards, Goldman and Sachs. Right? Again, this is the nurses union trying to portray her in this negative way, again, as some oppressive, obnoxious, ruler who will push you around just like, an obnoxious queen would. Next, please. And it almost worked until this woman stepped forward. The Whitman was almost elected until this woman, who was a former housekeeper of hers, stepped forward and said that, look at the language here. Meg Whitman treated me like a piece of garbage, right? So, this former housekeeper was in the country illegally. She lied about it. She provided a fake social security number when the IRS contacted Meg Whitman. She learned about it. She asked her about it. She had been lied to, and Meg Whitman fired her. And then, of course, right on schedule, the day after Meg Whitman won the debate against Democrat Jerry Brown, Nikki Diaz steps forward, and Meg Whitman treated me like a piece of garbage. And at that point forward, the campaign was over. In a 44% Latino state, running against Meg Whitman, who the other team had successfully portrayed as someone lacking those qualities of caring and fairness, the campaign was over. Next, please. Next slide. Yep. So our key takeaways are, let's run through them. Let's recognize that people make their judgments intuitively. Let's bring the whole list up on the screen here. Voters of different philosophies make judgments based upon different moral foundations, so you should be sensitive to what type of an audience you're trying to reach. If you're trying to reach an urban audience, maybe in a downtown central business district, people who live in a highly urbanized left-leaning area, we're going to want to construct messages that resonate with their moral foundations, as opposed to if we're out in a rural Manitoba, we might construct, even on the same issue, we might construct different messages that are anchored into a different set of moral foundations, knowing the difference between the two. So we want to tie our messages in to the right moral foundation for our audience, and never concede the caring or fairness side of your argument to the other team. Never concede that. Make sure that you always protect that flank. You are on the side of caring or fairness, whatever the issue happens to be. And the great thing about free market ideas, lower taxes, limited government, personal responsibility, free enterprise, etc., is that they are more caring and they are better in terms of outcomes, right? So we just have to make sure that we communicate that effectively for your particular issue. I've got some recommended reading on the final slide, which is up here. For anyone involved in public policy, if you're taking the time to be part of this wonderful conference today that Troy and company have put together, please do yourself a favor, read these two books before everything opens back up. While we still have, we're still at home, unfortunately, with COVID and so on, with lockdowns or restrictions, read these two books. You will not regret it. The first is The Light Switch by Jack Schafer. It's written by a former FBI behavioral psychologist who's talking about the nonverbal signals that we send to people and how they can draw people toward us or push them away. He walks through something called the friendship formula, which is the 4 components that are needed in order to build relationships with other people, recognizing that politics and life is 75% relationships, 25% everything else. The second is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Why The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Much of the data in this presentation is drawn from that wonderful book. I strongly recommend it. I promise if you read these two books, they will give you the X-ray vision you need to be more effective in the public policy arena. And finally, let me give a plug for my own organization, Leadership Institute. We are very proud to have done many trainings in Canada, very often with the Conservative Party of Canada, but with other groups as well. We're available to do online programs for you and with you, or in person. As soon as conditions permit. You can visit us at leadershipinstitute.org. We're delighted to work with anyone who's part of Troy's wonderful network here, and we wish you all the success in the world in defeating every socialist, communist, and vegetarian you can find. If you're a vegetarian and you're here, that's okay. We call that outreach. We're delighted you're part of this. But I hope you found this helpful, and with that, I'll turn it back over to the organizers. So thank you very much.